To start, I've entitled this talk Neuroscience and Spirituality Towards a Thomistic Approach. Why towards a Thomistic approach? So this is a growing field of empirical work, and there have been a variety of approaches and methodologies. And one of the big challenges is the dialogue with philosophy and philosophical and theological perspectives. There's quite a lot of good recent research from a more philosophical perspective, whereas from a theological perspective, very little so far, although several younger scholars are now beginning to be interested in this. Now, when it comes to neuroscience in general, we know that there's a need for good philosophy. Daniel Dehaan, who is one of the, I would say, emerging stars in this philosophical and Thomistic philosophy in dialogue with neuroscience, he points out in one article that one of the big challenges is the hazard of the unreflective conceptual framework in much of neuroscientific research, conflation, so to speak, of different levels of reality and the human being. Now, when it comes to the study of spirituality and neuroscience, then this further accentuates the need for a theological perspective and evaluation. We need theology to clarify what is meant theologically in the various methodologies, and to interpret the results and to complement what neuroscience offers with a bigger picture coming from theological knowledge. And so my goal here is to provide something that might help towards this sort of dialogue. This will be, I'm afraid, a tentative and clumsy attempt to offer something, but I hope it will be helpful to others. And I especially hope to encourage others to explore this field, not to be afraid of this field, so to speak. Now, I have an outline of the talk here. I'll start by explaining what I mean by this Thomistic framework, including some philosophical and theological principles that I think are helpful when we have a dialogue on this kind of neuroscientific research. Then I'll explain three recent approaches, the work of Lisa Miller, entitled The Awakened Brain. That's her popular work, popular book summarizing a lot of her personal journey and research. Then David Yaden and Andrew Newberg, The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. And finally, Ian McGilchrist and his Hemisphere hypothesis. There's quite a lot of material there to cover, so let's see how much I'm able to cover in this time. And then with each of these, I'll provide some evaluation and dialogue. So let's begin with this kind of towards the Thomistic framework. I don't try to be here like complete, but simply to provide some helpful pointers that might guide us in this sort of dialogue and evaluation of the literature. I'll begin with philosophical principles and the basic, well, before I go to philosophy, just one point, is just a question of general attitude. A Thomistic approach, I think, includes, if we follow the spirit of St. Thomas, a certain openness and interest towards new knowledge in general, towards the sciences. That's the spirit that Aquinas himself had in his time, and some people were even scandalized by that to an extent. But he was very creative in that dialogue with Aristotelian sources and others. At the same time, it needs to be done carefully, calmly evaluating and assessing the various claims being made. Now, going to philosophy then, I believe in general the Thomistic philosophical tradition is one of the best and most helpful frameworks for understanding much of contemporary neuroscience. It's a very robust and time-tested framework, and many neuroscientists are seeing that it's helpful. Now, there's a key challenge in understanding or interpreting neuroscientific studies, which is in general the reductive nature of many neuroscientific claims and the danger of these kind of dualistic accounts. Some people call it crypto-Cartesianism. So the person may be seen just as a product of its parts and ultimately of the physical and chemical processes. And so the brain is kind of seen as the complete explanation. And sometimes the soul may be introduced then, but as a radically distinct and almost independent reality, as in the Cartesian scheme. And so what the Thomistic tradition offers here is a robust understanding of the hylomorphic composition, the principle that man is formed of a material and formal principle as co-principles, which together form an integrated whole. And following the so-called mereological principle of Aristotle, the principle concerning the wholes and the parts, it reminds us that parts are only a partial explanation of the whole. So when we think about the human being, Daniel Dehaene, who I think is one of the great names to look at if you want to go deeper into this, he has some great talks also at the Thomistic Institute website and several papers. He proposes this personal versus subpersonal distinction. So rather than talking about mind and body distinction, the personal and subpersonal distinction. So the personal level is that integrated whole, which includes the spiritual soul and the material element, including the bodily organs like the brain. And the subpersonal level is those various levels that offer complementary explanations for what happens to the person, the man. So the soul is what brings about the organization of the whole, including the brain. And the brain is a part of the whole, an organ that coordinates various other parts of the whole. Now, within the specifically Thomistic understanding of the hylomorphic composition of the human being, there's this notion of the spiritual soul and the immaterial nature of the intellect. This has some important consequences that we'll see in a moment, are quite important for interpreting some of these claims about spirituality and neuroscience. On the one hand, the spiritual soul implies that principle of openness to God, to transcendence. The spiritual soul is, so to speak, the principle or seed of man's noetic powers and operations, the intellect and the rational appetite, the will, that are distinct from the psychosomatic powers and operations. But on the other hand, they form an integrated whole. So although the acts of the rational soul cannot be performed by a sensory organ, as Aquinas points out, they systematically interact with the embodied psychological powers that Aquinas calls the internal senses. And this interaction is termed by Aquinas the conversio ad phantasmata. And this means that the higher powers and operations cannot act without these subpersonal levels, the psychosomatic powers. The exercise of intellectual powers is such that it activates the lower, essentially embodied powers, and that's why we shouldn't be surprised to find this, or what neuroscientists call neural correlates of these various powers of the soul. On the other hand, brain injuries, for example, and other changes to the physical organ, the brain, which, so to speak, sustains the higher acts of the soul, will influence, will have an impact. So, for example, one may become incapable of intellective operations as a result of brain injury. Or, for example, intoxicants will influence reasoning and choices and perception. Further, finally, I would argue that at the philosophical level, this specifically Thomistic understanding of man implies a certain duality, not dualism, but a certain duality within the human soul. Aquinas speaks about, uses that metaphor that man stands at the horizon between the material and the immaterial worlds or dimensions of reality. And so normally we depend fundamentally on the senses for our interaction with the outside world, and we are, so to speak, necessarily tied to the material dimension. But other possibilities exist. There is the possibility of direct communication with God. God can reveal things. God can provide direct revelation to the soul. There is possible interaction with angels as pure spirits. There can be ecstatic experiences, which Aquinas himself experienced as well, which are extraordinary, but within the realm of possibilities for a human being. And similarly, the beatific vision, the ultimate end of man, in a sense, is like metaphorically seeing with God's eyes, with the light of glory, which is a profound supernatural participation in God's way of knowing, and obviously inseparable from loving God by the help of God's grace. Now, briefly, I'll then outline a few theological principles that we'll see in a moment why they are helpful. Man's creation, man has been created in the image of God and made for communion with God. God is love, has made the whole of reality, and is an active principle through his grace, by which he calls man to himself, calls him to communion, donates the gift of forgiveness of sins and promise of eternal life, and fundamentally the gift of himself. Now, concerning the interaction, so to speak, of the dimension of the natural dimension and the dimension of grace, the dimension of interaction between the creature and the creator, Aquinas has this, and so as kind of a master principle for much of his theology, this what I call here nature grace principle, that grace does not destroy nature but perfects it. This includes various things, for example, that within human nature there is a certain capacity for grace. Man is capas gratiae, capable of being united to God and elevated to that order of grace. But even though this principally involves the spiritual soul, it also involves the whole human person, including the psychosomatic powers. And as regarding the way in which grace perfects nature, Aquinas uses at least these two key kind of double movement, healing or purifying grace, which helps man to come out of his self-centeredness and so be transformed, and elevation, which fundamentally is friendship with God, loving IU, relationship with God. So very briefly, to clarify some concepts to applying these kind of nature grace principles. So with these key notions like religion and spirituality, we can say that there's a range of meanings within the Thomistic framework. So religion can be seen as a natural virtue, simply the virtue of the creature in worshipping, praising, giving thanks to God as creator. But this natural virtue can be purified by grace, cleansed of unhealthy elements, error, confusion, idolatry, and so on, and elevated to the relationship of divine filiation, sonship with God, and worship of God as Father. Similarly, with the notion of spirituality, this is a more kind of a modern term, used a lot in this neuroscience and spirituality studies, because it's kind of a non-confessional, interreligious and beyond religious term. To some extent, it's a subset of the acts of religion, but perhaps it goes also beyond that, because it's often defined in a way that also atheists can be spiritual in some sense. Now, from a Thomistic point of view, I think that's actually quite fine, as long as we remember that there's kind of a proper sense of spirituality, which is spiritual life in the sense of life in the Spirit, life of grace, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and so acts of listening, meditation, thanksgiving in the Holy Spirit and the sacramental life, supporting that out of love. But we can speak of an extended sense of spirituality, but we need to be purified and raised by grace. And of course, the goal of the spiritual life will not be just well-being in the present life, but beatitude in eternal life. Now, with this framework or background in mind, let's have a look at three different recent proposals. And I'll be quite synthetic, even somewhat impressionistic, and I'll try to be quite non-technical. But I invite you as listeners to explore further. So all of these three proposals have been synthesized in books that are very interesting, enjoyable to read. And there's also lots of videos and podcasts available interviewing these authors. So please do dig in deeper. So there are three, what I would say, complementary approaches. One is by Lisa Miller. She focuses on spiritual practices and their rootedness in the kind of natural potential in the brain. Yaden and Newberg focus on extraordinary spiritual experiences and what role might be played by the brain in them. And Nia McGilchrist offers kind of an updated version of the controversial hemisphere hypothesis, and argues for some implications for the dynamics of spirituality arising out of that hypothesis. Let's start with Lisa Miller. So Lisa Miller, who's a professor of psychology and spirituality at Columbia University currently, she has an interesting personal path in her work. She comes from a secular Jewish background, but through a kind of an experience of converging scientific evidence, developed, that led to a kind of a transformation of her own vision of the brain, the human being, and the world, and that led to the development of this model that she summarizes in this popular work, The Awakened Brain. So what was her story like? She began in clinical psychology, working with inpatients with serious mental health problems and so on, but became frustrated with the existing methods, the feeling that they were quite powerless to help the patients. But she had one specific experience on Yom Kippur, when some of the patients requested that they celebrate that. She describes that very beautifully in the book. And the experience, in spite of her, that she wasn't really a practicing or observant Jew, the experience was that spirituality seems to help people quite a lot, people who are struggling with mental health issues, but it was a taboo in the profession, especially at the time. She went on to do more research on depression, using what she describes an epidemiological method, namely looking at broad patterns in from a kind of a distance, specifically applying a risk versus resilience model of depression. And just synthesizing the key point there, one of the findings was that the significant impact of personal spirituality on depression risk versus resilience. That was something that hadn't been really studied. It was kind of a taboo apparently at the time. And she was therefore very surprised by the finding that, particularly when both mother and child said that spirituality was important to them, that was a major factor of resilience against depression. Now, this led her to explore more deeply the question of spirituality and depression, and further research on the brain. Now, here's her definition of spirituality: a sense of a personal relationship with a higher power. She contrasts that with her definition of religion, which would be adherence to religion, to religious rules and practices. I'll say something about that distinction later, but that's just to understand the methodology with which she's working. So the sort of model that she develops develops in three steps. The first one is this notion of spirituality as a form of protection against depression. But further studies on the brain suggest that there are these clear, what she calls spiritual neural correlates. There are many other people who have studied and found these sort of correlates as well. Andrew Newberg, actually, who will be one of the next people we'll look at, he's also a pioneer in this field. Specifically, just as a very brief synthesis of some of the technical terminology. So they did this extensive study of some brain scans with young adults, asking them to tell a story of when you felt a deep connection with a higher power, where the participants might conceptualize that as God or Jesus or Allah and so on. A deep connection that was with a higher power that was loving and guiding. And what they found was that the same neural correlates lit up regardless of the background. And there are some further details and complications in the way in which they did the study. But the key elements were that there are certain areas or parts of the brain that are activated, what they call the bonding network, the frontotemporal network, which is activated, for example, when a child is being held in the loving arms of their parents or grandparents. The parietal lobe, which expresses feelings of unity and belonging, which is plays a role in interpreting the world around us, a kind of the sense of commonality and unity with others, and broad awareness, move from kind of the narrow tactical mode of attention to the ventral attention network, which activates this kind of broad awareness, and that enables seeing the big picture rather than focused on details. That led to further development, which is then described particularly in the book. So the idea of the awakened brain refers to this. So we can make a distinction here. This the earlier point is what she talks about, the spiritual brain. So the argument is that these spiritual neural correlates suggest that the brain is, so to speak, prepared. So everyone's brain, normal, healthy brain, is hardwired, so to speak, for spirituality, but that can also be learned and developed and cultivated. But she also further developed this broader thesis about two different types of awareness, two different types of relating to the world. One would be this achieving awareness, which is more focused on pursuing a goal, and that has already been set. And then, on the other hand, this awakened awareness, which is for connecting with the sense of mystery, the connection with others, the kind of the sense of totality, and being one. So a few thoughts in terms of evaluation and dialogue with this model. Just very briefly about the depression studies. Their findings seem to make a lot of sense. Without going into too much detail, if we think about the hylomorphic model that I discussed earlier, it implies that there are spiritual and psychosomatic dimensions to the human being, and that would seem to be part of what we call also depression. Depression has to do with questions of meaning, of connection, being loved, accepted, and understood. These are needs of the person, not of the brain. But at the same time, they will manifest in the brain, and we know then also that there may be kind of this bottom-up processes that cause the experience of depression. So it's really precisely the totality of the person, both the personal and subpersonal levels together, that may trigger depression. As regards the awakened brain model and the idea of the spiritual brain, I think that also fits quite well this Thomistic hylomorphic model. One nice thing there in Lisa Miller's work is that she or her team, they don't try to explain spirituality from the brain, like so to speak, bottom up, but rather the argument is that spirituality is something natural to man in the sense of the body-soul composition. It it's reflected also in the healthy brain and the finding that which I think I forgot to mention the detail that that the reason for that protection, at least one reason for why spirituality provides certain significant protection from the risk of depression is that it seems to make strong those areas of the brain that are thin precisely in those who are depression prone or more in the risk of depression. So we think about that in terms of the nature grace framework. It would seem that human nature in its totality, including the dynamics of the brain, so to speak, made for that connection, made to be used in connecting to God, ultimately God, as we understand it in the Christian tradition, and therefore also the exercise of what Aquinas would call the virtue of religion, but it's specifically in this sense of really a personal relationship with God, which ultimately is possible with the help of grace. Well, that will have positive consequences for the human composite as a whole, including the brain. So, in other words, as embodied spiritual beings, we can cultivate that side as well, and it will also be reflected in other aspects like mental health. Regarding the notion of spirituality, just one point there that it's somewhat ambiguous, and I think she has perhaps a too negative notion of religion, but ultimately I don't think that's wrong. It just requires a bit of clarification. So obviously Christian vision of religion is precisely relational. It's not just an external adherence to rules and practices. And God is love, and that is the ultimate fabric, so to speak, of reality. So if the brain is somehow capable of, in some sense, perceiving that and tuning into that dimension, well, that makes a lot of sense. Perhaps from a Thomistic and Catholic perspective, we would rather speak of contemplative gaze on reality as a way of looking at kind of the awakened brain. Is kind of seems to be related to this kind of contemplative gaze. Let's go to the next book. These are two authors, The Variety of Spiritual Experience by David Yaden and Andrew Newberg. This is a book that is related to a much older book by William James called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And the authors, what they, in a sense, are interested in doing is kind of a continuation and updating of the work of William James. They admire him, and they are neuroscientists who use kind of contemporary findings and methods and psychology to kind of continue doing that. And they mention, interestingly, David Yaden, who is the lead author. He had his own significant spiritual experience in his youth at a time when he was considered himself an atheist, and so these sort of things, yeah, just as anecdotal, it's interesting to see that that's kind of what pushed him to explore this field. Now, concerning the objectives was to do a deeper empirical survey of information concerning this kind of spiritual experiences that people have, and to dig deeper concerning different triggers, neural patterns, perhaps comparison with experiences induced by therapeutic psychedelics and so on. In terms of methodology, the definition of spiritual experience is quite central here. So what they, in the large body of interview survey, they used two factors. One is that it's an intensely altered state of consciousness, in the line of William James's earlier work. And secondly, a seeming perception of an unseen order of reality. So an intensely altered state of consciousness and a seeming perception of an unseen order of reality. So we're talking about these kind of extraordinary religious experiences, and that's what they're interested in. Agnosticism here refers to this kind of professional agnosticism concerning the metaphysical realities. So they stay away from evaluating or making claims about does this say something about the existence of God and what happens in terms of connection to reality. It's just, phenomenological in the sense of understanding and taking, so to speak, taking seriously the experience as an experience. Now, in terms of findings, findings. Okay, they develop a certain typology based on factor analysis that they use to develop different clusters of different types of extraordinary spiritual experiences, which are ultimately 6 types. So numerous experiences, this kind of experiences of encounters with divinity, revelatory experiences, voices, visions, and epiphanies. Synchronicity experiences are this sort of just kind of a less difficult, less easily defined. Everything happens for a reason, kind of a sense of providence. Signs in nature and events in ordinary life interpreted as highly significant. Mystical experiences refer to unity and ego dissolution experiences, aesthetic experiences, awe and the sublime, and paranormal experiences like ghost, angels, and other entities. I'll mention here that there's a very nice podcast interview between Michael Ferguson of Harvard Medical School and David Yaden, which is in YouTube and different podcast platforms, discussing this book. And Michael Ferguson, who is a Catholic neuroscientist, he mentions that, well, this topology fits quite well kind of a Christian Catholic ontology of different dimensions and different, so to speak, things that could happen in the spiritual life. And Yaden, who is not a Christian, at least not an active Christian, was quite surprised to hear that. So it's just an interesting observation. Some findings very briefly. One interesting thing, which is not from their own data, but from previous information from the Gallup and over several decades and another empirical data, just a questionnaire interview, is that the high prevalence of this kind of experiences. So it's about 35% of the population that has had once or more, usually not many times in their life, usually just once, which is quite interesting. So Yaden, for example, in the podcast that I mentioned, he asked the viewers to guess how common these might be. So they range from 5% to 80%. So really, this sort of empirical information is quite interesting just to get a sense of how common these are. But at the same time, Yaden mentions that 40% of them, in the data that they gathered, had never told anyone else about this experience, mainly because they were concerned about being seen as mentally ill. Concerning different triggers, so there's some information concerning different triggers. They're mostly spontaneous in the sense of not sought. So almost 70% are they perceived as spontaneous. There are certain personality types that are somewhat more prone to these experiences. A type called this kind of absorption type, which is a person easily moved by music, poetry, and so on. There may be some degree of genetic predisposition. As regards brain processes, it's a bit here and there. Frontal lobe, that sort of, they discuss these sort of claims made earlier also in the literature. Near-death experiences, trauma. So there are many different types of circumstantial factors and others that may be triggers. None of them really explain causally well what's going on, but that seems to be one clear factor, that there are triggers that make them more likely. Interestingly, there are two triggers that seem to be relatively reliable empirically. One is certain religious practices such as meditation. So people who practice sustained regular meditation are much more prone to experiencing this kind of extraordinary spiritual experiences. And secondly, psychedelics. So various kinds of psychedelics. The book has quite a lot of information on that. It's a new but developing field of research. Not at all always, but it's a fairly reliable trigger. Concerning mental health outcomes, so there's an interesting question there concerning the positive versus pathological effects of these experiences. So broadly said, a small minority experienced them as highly beneficial, transformative for basically the rest of their life. The majority as generally positive, likely positive, and then a small minority experiences pathological consequences, so might need therapy for kind of self-reintegration and even hospitalization in a very small percentage of cases. It might be due to fear of demonic possession, might be due to this kind of loss of the sense of self. And the idea basically seems to be that in the sense of the self, the brain and its dynamics plays a big role. There's some discussion about how certain brain dynamics involved in these sort of experiences might destabilize the sense of self. And finally, there's discussion, as I said, about therapeutic use of psychedelics. Often, not always, they may elicit spiritual experiences. But interestingly, also expectations play a big role there. And there's some further research on perhaps some significant differences between these spontaneous religious experiences and psychedelically induced religious experiences. Some practical relevance discussed by Yaden and Newberg themselves. One is the pastoral relevance of kind of just the information on the prevalence of these sort of experiences. It's a relief to many people to know that they are quite common and they are probably not due to mental illness. And they offer kind of quite a balanced, empirically grounded approach to this prevalence. As regards medical or therapeutic uses, there's some potential use of psychedelics as therapeutic resources. Now, some evaluation and dialogue then. So philosophically, I'm not going to say much about that, but it seems to me that the Thomistic framework of the embodied nature of the Thomistic framework fits very well this sort of research and findings due to the embodied nature of religious experiences. So even if we assume that there's even if we assume that this is induced by a very special grace of God and helping the person to conversion, to love God, and so on, it will be manifest, it will be embodied in some way and manifested in the brain and so on. And at the same time, the duality of the soul that I mentioned earlier seems to may play a role in there. It's kind of this openness to extraordinary dynamics with the spiritual reality. That obviously takes us to the more theological evaluation. One of the broad picture impressions in these experiences that it's very common for the people to experience a sense of love that pervades all of reality, to feel called to reconciliation, to forgiveness, trust, unity with others. And it seems to me that that fits very well a Christian understanding of God and kind of the foundation of reality and our call to unity with God. At the same time, we need to distinguish between these extraordinary experiences and the ordinary spiritual life in the proper sense, as I suggested earlier. And that may be, concerning what can a Thomist take from this. So one is that just quite simply more information on people's experiences. And regarding the more specific neuroscientific dimension, it may offer a more nuanced understanding of the potentially corporal triggers of mystical states. I don't think that's really news to us in the Catholic tradition, because we already in the past we were aware that, for example, certain intoxicants or sleep deprivation and so on may produce this sort of experiences or something similar to mystical experiences. So, but then theologically, we would need to dig deeper into those specific experiences in order to evaluate them. So one of the methodological limitations of these sort of studies is that the kind of the agnosticism forces the study to move on a very general level without making what we would call, theological evaluation of the phenomena. On the other hand, what can a Thomist give to this sort of research? Well, especially that wider ontology, that there is a spiritual world, so to speak, of God, His grace, angels, saints, and demons as well. And that wider picture concerning the purpose of the spiritual life. So obviously experiences like these need to be channeled to a higher end, which is not just experience for its own sake because it feels great or something, but channeled towards that personal transformation and union with God. In the Catholic tradition of spiritual theology, there's often emphasis on that need for purification, like less experience and more forgetfulness of self. Now I need to ask you, Father Thomas, I think I'm running out of time, so would it be best if I...
Yeah, so I'd say if you've got another maybe 5 minutes or 5 or 7 minutes, and then that'll give us about 10 minutes for questions. So
very good, thank you. Yeah. So, well, obviously this is a very complex model, but I'll say something here because I think this is the one that is perhaps theologically the more interesting one. So Ian McGilchrist and his hemispheric model. So for those of you who don't know anything about this may be far too superficial, but I'll explain very briefly the central idea. So Ian McGilchrist has kind of popularized and further developed this model that was discovered first in the 1970s with so-called split brain patients and patients with certain brain lesion involving damage to one hemisphere, which is quite common in stroke cases, and the kind of study of the phenomenology and behavior of those patients. And drawing on a large body of further research, he has developed certain we might say, phenomenology of the characteristic features of these two modes of attention, as he calls them. The point is that, and the argument is that the mind that is rooted in the dynamics of the brain is, so to speak, prepared or made for two different types of attention, which are complementary, and this is a very synthetic presentation of those features. So the left brain, which would be typically characterized as the kind of the analytic, abstract mode of attention, would be detailed, local, focused on kind of central information, focuses on the easily graspable, deals with the familiar, aims for certainty, presents the world as explicit and decontextualized, and is good at using abstractions and signs. And the right hemisphere, in contrast, and the mode of attention, which is more the more intuitive and experiential mode, would be more attentive to the periphery, the background, that which is not immediately graspable, whatever is new. It's good at sustaining ambiguity, seeing as implicit and embedded in context, and generally dealing with experience and embodied knowledge. Now, that's a very quick summary. McGilchrist himself develops in a number of talks and some papers kind of an application of this to the spiritual life. In a very brief summary, he argues that because God or the divinity, whatever, as he's not explicit Christian, although I think on a personal level he is, the mystery of the divine requires this right hemisphere attention. To correctly grasp, so to speak, God, one needs not to grasp, but to be open to mystery, to the other, because the reality of God is something radically different from this world. That's which can be literally grasped and explicitly formulated. And he defends quite a radical apophaticism as kind of the appropriate form of right hemisphere religiosity and spirituality, and accuses kind of when the left hemisphere approach takes over, then it leads to kind of dogmatism, unhealthy dogmatism and fundamentalism, which tries to kind of reduce religion to that which is already known, the familiar, that which can be explicit and decontextualized and formulated doctrinally. Now, very briefly, some thoughts on how to evaluate that from a Thomistic point of view. Now this is far too brief, I realize, but in terms of the philosophy of mind, this perhaps presents further complications from the viewpoint of Thomistic psychology and epistemology. But I think they might be compatible, but it requires some further work. So obviously, that principle of Aquinas, that our knowledge is nevertheless always rooted in also that aspect or input of in dialogue with the brain, and further that even at the level of the intellect, he would distinguish between kind of the discursive and synthetic modes, which broadly correspond to the left and right hemispheres. As regards to spiritual life, there's a certain valid point, I think, that McGilchrist makes, but it needs to be corrected. And when we have a correct understanding of Christian vision of revelation and the role of dogma in supporting a stable spiritual life, we get precisely a stable collaboration between the left and right hemispheres. So broadly speaking, we might say the right hemisphere kind of attention is more geared towards liturgy, liturgical music, chant, biblical reading, meditation, contemplation, and so on. And the left hemisphere mode of attention is more geared towards understanding dogma, formulating doctrine explicitly, which plays a supportive role. And if we think about Aquinas and Aquinas's own spirituality, I think, first of all, it corresponds to that scheme. So maybe I wanted to include this for one reason, because it's a healthy reminder that Aquinas himself was not the kind of the hyper-rationalistic writer of the Summa alone, but fundamentally a contemplative who had a very profound Eucharistic piety and who was a poet and a mystic. And so with that note, I end. Thank you so much for your attention.